All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to CBHN's Health for Life series on prediabetes and prevention. My name is Amber Busby, the Associate Program Manager at the California Black Health Network. Today, we are here for session 6 of the 7-part series, Control the Controllable. We have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Candice A. Price, who has led this series, and I will introduce her momentarily, as well as Dr. Carson. Dr. Price will lead us in an important discussion around stress and the impacts of stress as it relates to prediabetes. A couple of housekeeping reminders. While this webinar is designed to be interactive throughout the session, you will be muted. We encourage you to use the raise hand feature if you've got any questions. I think that the chat box also works, so feel free to throw any questions in the chat box. We'll be monitoring both of those and have some time at the end for questions. And before I introduce the speaker, I want to share a little about CBHN in case any attendees are unfamiliar with our organization. The California Black Health Network's vision is a California where every African American and Black immigrant has the opportunity to live long, healthy lives free from violence, racism, and health inequities, regardless of their education, socioeconomic class, zip code, sexual orientation, gender identity, housing, or immigration status, and have access to high quality and equitable primary and behavioral health care to avoid unnecessarily succumbing to disease. We do this every day through outreach, education, policy, and advocacy work. At this time, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Candice Price, who is a metabolism and nutrition scientist whose career has focused on understanding the development and prevention of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. She received her PhD in endocrinology at UC Berkeley, where she studied alternate day fasting and the role of fat cells in the development of insulin resistance. During her time as an assistant professor at the University of California, Davis, Dr. Price investigated the mechanisms by which sugar-sweetened beverage consumption increases the risk for cardiometabolic disease in Black women. Her research portfolio also included examining the impact of naturally sweetened juice intake on health outcomes, the role of the gut microbiome and insulin resistance, psychological stress and sugar consumption, and the potential epigenetic effects of high sugar intake. In addition to her scientific career, Dr. Price is a certified diabetes prevention program coach and started one of the few DPP programs in the Sacramento region. As I'd mentioned, we are also joined tonight by Dr. Tiffany L Carson. Dr. Carson is an associate member and the inaugural George Edgecombe Scholar in the Department of Health Outcomes and Behavior in the Division of Population Sciences at Moffitt Cancer Center. She is also an associate professor in the Department of Oncological Sciences in the Morsani College of Medicine at the University of South Florida. Dr. Carson completed her bachelor's degree at Florida State University. She later received her master's degree and PhD in epidemiology from the University of Alabama at Birmingham and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Arkansas for medical sciences. As an applied epidemiologist, Dr. Carson has made significant contributions to the field of obesity treatment and cancer prevention research through her population-based biobehavioral, observational, and intervention studies. Dr. Carson is currently the PI of 2 NIH-funded R01 studies investigating behavioral and biological aspects of energy balance, cancer prevention, and health disparities. Dr. Carson has been published in multiple peer-reviewed journals, including Obesity, Psychosomatic Medicine, and JAMA. In addition to her research portfolio, Dr. Carson has nearly a decade of experience mentoring early-stage scientists. At this time, I'm pleased to turn it over to Dr. Candice Price.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amber, for that introduction. Let me start to share my slides. Okay, great. So today's webinar is all about managing stress and balancing diabetes prevention. Okay, so today what you will learn are the differences between psychological and physiological stress. We will spend some time talking about cortisol, which many of you may know as the stress hormone. We'll talk about differences in cortisol patterns in Black Americans. And then Dr. Carson will share some of her research, current research that's being done on the effects of stress and body weight. And then we will finish up with some tips and tools to manage and cope with stress. So before we begin, let's see what you all know. Okay, is this true or false? Stress increases the risk for type 2 diabetes. Okay, everyone thinks this is true. That is great. And hopefully that is why you're here today. Next question. There are two types of stress, mental and physiological. Which of the following statements is true? Only physiological stress impacts your risk for type 2 diabetes. Only mental stress or psychological stress impacts your risk for type 2 diabetes. Both physiological stress and mental stress impact your risk for type 2 diabetes, or neither physiological stress or mental stress have much impact on your risk for type 2 diabetes. Okay, so everyone agrees that both physiological stress and mental stress impact your risk for diabetes. And last question, which of the following strategies are healthy coping stress mechanisms? You can select more than one answer. Exercising, eating a slice of cake, mindfulness breathing, or having a glass of wine each night before bed. Okay, so everyone agrees that exercising is a healthy coping mechanism, and many of you also think that mindfulness breathing is a healthy coping mechanism. Okay, great. Well, let's see what more we can learn today. All right. So let's begin with just introducing the term psychological stress or mental stress. So this is the emotions that you feel under stressful conditions. So the focus is on your mind and your brain. Whereas physiological stress is the body's response to a stress. The stress could be psychological in nature, or it could be illness, for example. Activation of the sympathetic nervous system is the physiological response that occurs when you are exposed to a stressor. And so this activates increase in blood pressure, increase in heart rate, and releases of various amounts of hormones that are responsive to stress. So this includes cortisol, epinephrine that you might recognize as, or also know as adrenaline, norepinephrine, and dopamine. We're not going to really talk about all of these today. We're going to focus mostly on cortisol, and I will briefly introduce dopamine later. Okay, so there's two sort of levels of stress. There's acute stress. This is short-term stress exposure. So this could be an illness, a brief illness, such as the flu or COVID, sitting in a traffic jam, or maybe you're being scared or startled, you've gone to a haunted house or something. Now, chronic stress is stress over a long period of time. It doesn't have to be continuous. It can be repetitive, but we consider this to be chronic stress when it occurs multiple times and your body's exposed to either the same stressor or multiple different types of stressors over time. So there's something called weathering. This was a term that was first introduced by Dr. Arlene Geronimus in 1990. This is the book that discusses the term weathering. This is an accelerated biological aging or rapid wear and tear on the body. It is a result of chronic stress and is determined by examining your biological age of your cells or your tissues in comparison to your actual age or your chronological age. So this is something that has to be measured at the cellular level. Now, in Black Americans, weathering is most likely a result of years and generations of racism and discrimination. And so weathering can also appear outwardly as a result of accelerated aging within the cells, but also inside the way our cells and tissues function can also be impacted by weathering. So psychological stress disproportionately affects Black women and drives modifiable behaviors. Stress can trigger the desire to eat. So this is your appetite, not your hunger. And way back in one of the previous webinars, made a distinction between hunger versus appetite. So hunger is the physiological need to eat to eat calories and food to provide your body with nutrients. Appetite is the desire to eat. So it doesn't require a need for energy. And so stress can trigger appetite in the absence of a physiological need for caloric intake. Now, in doing so, it also promotes poor eating and drinking behaviors. One, because you may be consuming food or beverages containing calories, even when you're not actually hungry. But it also increases the intake of what we call highly palatable foods. So these are foods that are high in sugar or high in fat or both. It can lead to less physical activity, promote greater alcohol consumption, and also contribute to poor sleep. Now, there's something called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal or HPA axis. This is the pathway, if you will, that controls the release of cortisol. So like I mentioned earlier, many of us know cortisol as the quote unquote stress hormone, but cortisol also plays an important role in metabolism of our nutrients, glucose, fat, and protein. So the way this HPA axis works is there's a feedback mechanism that happens, and I won't spend too much time on the details of this, but essentially there's signaling that occurs from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary glands and then to the adrenal glands, which is where the cortisol is made and released. And so when your body makes enough cortisol to do the actions that it needs to do, then it feeds back on the hypothalamus and the pituitary to say, hey, we have enough cortisol, you can shut down the signaling, we don't need to make any more cortisol. Under acute stress, for example, this axis turns on and releases cortisol. And we'll talk about later some of the actions that cortisol elicits. So you may remember this chart from the previous webinar where we talked about sleep and this diurnal pattern that cortisol has throughout the day. So what I'll mainly point out is that cortisol, it peaks in the morning about 30 minutes after you wake up, and it gradually decreases over the course of the day, with the lowest concentrations being at night when you're sleeping, and then it'll gradually increase in the morning hours in preparation for waking time. Now, when we're under stressful, either acute stress or in chronic stress, this pattern of cortisol can change. So here's an example of a study in which participants were exposed to a stress test. Well, in this case, 2 stress tests. There's a mist test which is known as the Montreal Imaging Stress Task. And it's essentially a timed test where no matter how you perform on the test, there's a panel of judges and they give you negative feedback. And the negative feedback is what is supposed to elicit the stress in the participant. And then there's also this MDT test that they implemented in the study, which is a mnemonic discrimination test, and it's a memory test. So they, in one group, the stress group, they expose them to these 2 different stress tests. And then in the control group shown at the bottom, in the open diamonds, they did not have exposure to these stress tests. And so you can see that in the stress group, those that underwent these 2 stress tests, their cortisol levels increased throughout the test and peaked at the beginning of the second test. And then after both tests were over, they gradually became, the cortisol gradually reduced, but you could see that even 2 hours later after the test is done, that cortisol level was still elevated in comparison to the control group. Acute stress before sleep can also elevate cortisol, and this is associated with an inability to fall asleep. So in this study, they also exposed participants to the MIST test before either taking a nap or staying awake. So I just want you to focus on the group that are in the circles. So the dark circle here at the top is the group that was exposed to the stress test prior to taking the nap. The nap is in the gray. And then the bottom open circles here is this group that was not exposed to a stressor before the nap. And you can see that obviously exposure to the stress test increased the cortisol levels and in the test group. And then after their nap time, the group that was exposed to the stress test still had elevated cortisol levels in comparison to the control group. And then they also looked at sleep latency, or how long it took the participants to fall asleep. And in the group that was exposed to the stress test, you can see they have a higher sleep latency, or it took them more time to fall asleep. Okay, so chronic stress also dampens cortisol release. That morning cortisol peak that I mentioned as part of that diurnal cortisol pattern is known as the cortisol awakening response, or CAR for short. And this can become blunted with chronic stress. So below, you're seeing a graph that shows you different changes of cortisol over the course of the day under different conditions. This is just an example, not from any one particular study that I can provide details about, but essentially, and one, the gray is sort of what a normal peak of cortisol might look like. The blue is elevated cortisol awakening response, and in the green is a low cortisol awakening response. Now, some individuals are more affected by stress in terms of its effects on the cortisol awakening response. So this is an example of a study that was done in First Nations people. So Aborigines, for example, were involved in this study, and they measured cortisol awakening response in Indigenous and non-Indigenous individuals. You can see the Indigenous individuals had a lower blunted cortisol awakening response. Now, we often see the same thing in Black Americans. So in this graph here, presented differently, we're also showing you the changes in the cortisol awakening response. This is at wake up here. You can see that the African-American group had a reduction in that cortisol awakening response. And remember, that cortisol awakening response is supposed to be the time at which you have the highest levels of cortisol during the day. But we see the opposite at bedtime, where at bedtime, when cortisol is supposed to be the lowest, African Americans have the highest concentrations of cortisol. Cortisol increases glucose production from the liver and breaks down fat that's stored in tissues. So really quickly, we'll review the actions of cortisol, you may, if you attended the previous webinar, you may recognize this slide. So in the liver, cortisol stimulates glucose production so that it can increase the glucose availability in the blood. This would occur in this case of fasting situations when you're not eating food and you need energy. In the muscle, cortisol reduces glucose uptake. And in the fat cells, cortisol stimulates the breakdown of fat, again, to provide your body with energy. Now, you may notice that all of these actions are in opposition of the actions of insulin. So essentially, cortisol and insulin do the opposite things. And so think about how that might impact our insulin action and ability to put away glucose when we have changes in our cortisol that may be increasing or decreasing at times when they should not be, and when that HPA axis is impacted and not functioning properly to release the cortisol or inhibit the cortisol when necessary. So chronic stress also promotes weight gain by increasing appetite in the absence of nutritional needs. So cortisol stimulates a hunger neuron in the brain called MPY or AGRP. If you remember back from, I might have talked about this in the nutrition webinar, where this is the same neuron that is stimulated by ghrelin, which is known as the hunger hormone. It's also the same the same neuron that's inhibited by insulin. Cortisol also stimulates dopamine signaling in the brain, which increases the cravings for sugar and other high-calorie foods, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. And research has shown that 1 in 4 people use food as a coping mechanism for stress. Okay, and that's no coincidence. It's all about how your hormone and your brains respond to a stressor, and the need to use food as a stress coping mechanism. And 43% of people report overeating to cope with stress. Now, chronic stress promotes unhealthy weight gain. So abnormal fluctuations in cortisol promotes visceral fat accumulation, which we talked about previously in many other webinars. Again, visceral fat is that fat that's surrounding your organs, and is known as the bad fat. This is the fat that's associated with greater insulin resistance and risk for type 2 diabetes. So it reduces insulin sensitivity, increases appetite, and then associated with increase in consumption of foods that are high in sugar or high in fat. Now, in addition to the effects of cortisol on appetite, dopamine is another hormone that plays a very significant role, probably actually more significant than cortisol, and is known as the feel-good hormone. So dopamine plays various different roles. It is involved in memory, emotional regulation, but in this context, it also activates the reward center of our brain. And this helps us to also provide motivation for reward. So let's say that in response to a stressor, you decide to eat a chocolate chip cookie, and now you're getting that sensation, that feel-good sensation in your brain. It's also triggering that memory that, hey, if I eat this cookie, it's going to help calm me down and make me happy, and release some of that feeling of stressfulness. And so that creates that memory to repeat seeking out that reward. And so this can also lead to a repetitive consumption of foods that are sweet or highly palatable foods, because when you consume those highly palatable foods, it actually signals that dopamine release. And so chronic stress actually blunts this dopamine response to a food. And so what this could actually lead to is greater consumption of high calorie foods, specifically foods that are high in sugar, so that you can increase that dopamine activation. So in other words, you need more sweet things to consume more sweet things to elicit that feel-good dopamine response. Okay, so now I will go ahead and pass it along to Dr. Carson, who's going to talk some more about her work in the area of addressing stress and how that impacts weight loss or weight changes especially in Black individuals and other marginalized individuals from other historically marginalized communities.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Price, for really just nicely setting the stage with background in physiology and what we know about stress, behavior, and health outcomes. And so for the remainder of the talk, I will pivot and talk a little bit more about the research that's happening in this space. And before I get to some of my own personal work, I'll give you a little bit of background from the literature that really sort of provided the foundation and inspiration for my line of research. And so one of the first studies to really look at the role of stress in weight gain was published in the American Journal of Epidemiology back in 2009. And this study was a longitudinal follow-up study where they followed a cohort or group of individuals over 9 years to look at the role of stress at their baseline measurement and how that was associated with their weight at later time points. So these individuals didn't receive any intervention. This was strictly an observational study where they had over 1,300 people to complete surveys over time. This was the midlife in the US study. About 700, a little over 700 of the participants were women, and about 10.3% of participants were Black individuals. And so this study really focused on stressors in a few different domains. It included work, relationships, life constraints, and finances. And what they found from this, sort of very first study looking at this is that women reported higher levels of stress at baseline, and that has continued to persist in, pretty much every snapshot of measuring stress to current day. They also observed that among people with a higher baseline body mass index, stress was associated with greater weight gain. However, individuals who were normal weight at baseline did not really show an association between stress and weight change over time. And then another very interesting finding of this study was that more domains of stress were associated with weight gain among women compared to men. So for women, pretty much all of the domains that I listed, there was some association. However, for men, it was only in the domains of work and finances where there was a link between stress and weight change. And so another sort of way that this has been examined over time is through what is called a meta-analysis, and that is when you compile and analyze multiple individual studies to really try to give you some definitive results about a particular topic area. And so a couple of meta-analyses have been conducted related to stress and weight change over time. The first was published by Wardle and colleagues, where they included 14 studies. Now, among those 14 individual studies, there were some mixed findings. Some reported a positive relationship between stress and weight change, meaning with increase in stress, there is increase in weight gain over time. Some reported no relationship. And, there was also evidence that these observed relationships may be moderated by sex, which is consistent with what was reported in the first study that I mentioned. About a decade after that first meta-analysis, another group conducted another meta-analysis where they updated their data with newer studies and essentially came to the same conclusions, which is that psychosocial stress is a risk factor for weight gain over time, at least small to moderate weight gain, if unchecked through specific intentional measures to either manage stress or weight. And they also reported that higher risk for weight gain was related to activation of this HPA axis that Dr. Price described earlier, the sympathetic nervous system, and negative affect. And so as we started to learn more about the relationships between stress and weight gain over time, if unchecked, if there's no intervention, researchers started to think about the role of stress among individuals who are actively trying to lose weight through behavioral weight loss interventions. And so one of the first groups to look at that was Kim and colleagues, and they took the opportunity to analyze the role of baseline stress among a group of women with type 2 diabetes who are participating in a 6-month behavioral weight loss program. And what they saw essentially was that baseline stress, so stress level at baseline, was associated with less weight loss at 6 months. And that's also illustrated by this figure. So here, the score of less than 16 represents the stress measures. And this would be the lower end, and this is the higher end. On this axis, we have the amount of weight change that participants achieved. And so we see at this lower end of stress, individuals had more weight loss compared to those who had higher stress. And this study also reported that there was higher stress among individuals who dropped out of the study and who did not complete the intervention. So this really inspired a line of research for myself to think about whether adding a strong stress management component to current evidence-based behavioral weight loss programs could improve weight loss outcomes. Could we create some synergy to help people manage stress, which might in turn lead to better weight loss for those who are attempting weight loss? And so our first attempt at this was a study called Renew. This took place during my time at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, a little over 10 years ago. And this was a study where we wanted to examine the role of stress management in this behavioral weight loss program focused for Black women. So we enrolled 44 participants. To be eligible, individuals had to self-identify as a Black woman, be in the age range of 25 to 45 years old with a body mass index of 25 or greater, which is a clinical indicator of having overweight or having obesity. Individuals also had to have elevated stress levels as measured by a questionnaire at baseline that I'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment. So these eligible participants were then randomly assigned, as in the flip of a coin, to one of two treatment conditions. The first was a 12-week diabetes prevention program-based behavioral weight loss intervention, plus strategies for stress management. And I know you've heard about DPP through the course of this webinar series. I'll talk a little bit more about the components of DPP in just a moment, but it is certainly considered, has been considered one of the gold standard evidence-based behavioral weight loss programs over time. So there was the group that received DPP plus stress management strategies, and then another group received DPP alone. And the goal was to see if the stress management strategies led to greater weight loss. And so I'll briefly review the intervention components that were common to both arms of the study. So both groups convened for 60-minute group-based sessions. Both groups were led by Black master's level counselors so that there was racial concordance between the group leaders and the participants. Both groups really focused on fat and calorie intake goals, graded physical activity goals with the goal of eventually getting everyone to 150 minutes of physical activity per week, and then self-monitoring. And so these last three bullet points are really the cornerstones of the DPP intervention. And when we say self-monitoring, the key element of that is food journaling, or having individuals to record everything that they consume each day. Now, in addition to these components, individuals in the lifestyle plus stress management group also received training on healthy stress management strategies. And they essentially fell into three categories: relaxation strategies, behavioral, and cognitive strategies. And so examples of each of these are the following. So for relaxation, as you might imagine, relaxation strategies are things like getting a massage or progressive muscle relaxation, really taking intentional steps to physically relax the body and the mind. Behavioral strategies are more in terms of helping to manage the stress in your life. And so we teach things about time management, we teach things about organization, we teach, how to take control of certain aspects of your life so that they don't lead to stress. And then when we refer to cognitive strategies, these are things like positive affirmations and positive reinforcements, also challenging all or nothing thinking and encouraging people to sort of not fall into that dichotomy. And so in the Renew study, our primary outcome or primary measure was body weight. And then we also wanted to measure change in stress over time. And we did that primarily through two approaches. So first we have the perceived stress scale 10. This is a 10-item survey that individuals complete on their own. And the goal is to capture the amount of what is perceived as global stress individuals have experienced in the previous month. The perceived stress scale is widely used. It's been validated across diverse populations and is, again, a widely used measure in the field of stress management and stress research. Because it is self-report and objective in nature, we wanted self-report and subjective in nature, we wanted a more objective measure as well. And so we collected saliva samples from participants for 3 days, following a standard protocol to collect first thing in the morning, which ties back to some of the things that you heard from Dr. Price a little while ago. And because we wanted to use these samples for salivary cortisol analysis, again, giving us this objective measure of stress within the body. And then lastly, we wanted to measure participant adherence, and this was measured through attendance and self-monitoring. And so here's just a snapshot of the participants in this study. Again, these were all Black women in their mid-40s. All participants had a body mass index of over 30, which is indicative of clinical diagnosis of obesity. This population was fairly well educated, with most participants having at least some college education or beyond. And then here we just have the baseline scores for perceived stress scale and salivary cortisol. And there were really no significant differences in any of these indicators by group at baseline. And so in terms of our results, here are just a few examples of some of our predetermined outcomes that we wanted to examine. So I'll start by saying that in research, we try to achieve what's called statistical significance in terms of our difference in our fully scaled, fully powered studies. With this being a pilot study with a small sample size, we did not have the power to detect statistical differences, but we did see some trends that were encouraging. And so first we have here, you can see that the lifestyle plus stress management group lost about twice as much weight as those who received the lifestyle intervention alone. There were not really any differences in the perceived stress scale score. However, when we come down to this objective measure of stress with salivary cortisol, we saw greater reductions, again, in those who got stress management training compared to those who did not. And then again, there were not really differences in any of our adherence measures. And so building on this, we really, were encouraged that this is a line of research worth pursuing. And so, I personally thought that there were some opportunities to further tailor it for Black women, make it relevant to the stressors that are experienced by Black women, and also offer strategies that are culturally tailored. And so to get closer to that, we conducted 3 highly structured focus groups using what's called the nominal group technique, or NGT, and got feedback from 33 Black women. We asked them the questions: what are the top sources of stress for women? What stressors relate specifically to Black women? And then in what ways do these stressors influence women's weight? And so here's just excerpts of some of the feedback that we got in these focus groups. And we go through a rigorous systematic process to really combine and distill, all of the quotes and responses that we get from our participants into themes. And so from this, we had really 5 themes to emerge. Our sources of stress were related to being a daily caregiver, related to work, related to stigma, discrimination, and bias, related to financial stress, and relationship stress. And here are just some direct quotes from some of the responses to the questions that we provided. So again, with question 1 being sources of stress for women, we heard taking care of everyone, advancing in my career, women don't get the same chances as men, paying for college as a single mother, trying to be in a good, happy relationship. But when we specifically asked about stresses for Black women, we got some different responses, things related to childcare as a single parent, job discrimination and being the only Black woman in the office, the safety of raising Black boys and being married to a Black man, given at the time it was, around 2020, and when we were seeing some of the injustices against certain groups in the US, concerns about not making much money on the job as men and white women. And so certainly some different things there that we wanted to address. And so as we enhanced our stress management, we wanted to keep those things in mind. We wanted to keep some of the evidence-based, tried and true stress management strategies in place, but how can we make this even more appropriate for Black women? So for example, for those who are struggling with the stress of being a daily caregiver, we wanted to focus on how to leverage social support. And that's something that one can be taught, how to leverage your social support, really building on this notion of collectivism that can, that is, sort of a staple or a cultural norm in the African-American and Black communities. I'll jump down here to things related to stigma and discrimination and bias. So we wanted to take it a step beyond just positive affirmations or positive self-statements and really focus those positive affirmations on having pride in one's race and one's sex. And so we went through, again, a very rigorous and systematic process to adapt our materials to address what we learned from these focus groups. And so that resulted in what is called the RESET study. And so that is one of the current NIH-funded studies that I am leading. It stands for Reducing Weight and Elevated Stress Levels Using Educational and Behavioral Tools. And so the main research question for RESET is whether adding this culturally tailored stress management component to evidence-based behavioral weight loss interventions lead to greater weight loss than the standard intervention. And our hypothesis is that it will. And so I'll quickly walk you through the flow of the study. We start with, a wide and robust recruitment effort. We screen participants to determine whether or not they meet our eligibility criteria, which I'll present in just a moment. And we confirm their eligibility through a baseline assessment. Once eligibility is confirmed, individuals go through an informed consent process so that they are fully aware of what study participation will entail, and so that they know their rights and protections as a study participant. Once the informed consent process is completed, they are then randomized to one of two intervention arms, and that's the DPP plus stress management, or DPP plus general women's health education. And we're doing this again to really isolate the effect of our stress management intervention compared to any other intervention that they could get out there. So once individuals are randomized to their groups, they then start weekly meetings. We converted this to be via Zoom because all of this sort of unfolded during the early days of the pandemic. There are still group-based sessions led by Black master's level registered dietitians, and they meet weekly via Zoom for about an hour to 75 minutes. The groups are held separately and they have separate group leaders. After 4 months, we collect some additional data so that we can check their progress and compare it to what is happening at baseline. And then they participate for the next 2 months in bi-weekly group-based meetings. We collect data again at 6 months. And then for the remaining 6 months of the study, which is more of, the maintenance phase, individuals can certainly continue to lose weight during that time if they want to. But we have a maintenance period where we're there to provide support through monthly meetings for the last 6 months. And then we do our final data collection at month 12. So to participate in RESET, individuals have to self-identify as a Black woman, have a body mass index of at least 30 or greater, be 21 to 75 years old, and have elevated stress levels. Again, this is measured through the Perceived Stress Scale survey. Individuals are excluded if they are pregnant or planning to become pregnant in the next year, have a known condition that influences weight loss, or if there is any medical or mental history for which participation in this type of program would be discouraged. And so here's just a quick, a couple of screenshots of some of our DPP adapted materials and some of the modifications that we've made. So we tried to make things visually appealing. I don't know if you've seen the original DPP materials, but we've adapted that some. We've included a lot of images of Black women of different ages and body types. And I will say I noticed that all of the women look pretty young in these couple of snapshots that I chose, but we were very intentional about making sure that it was a wide range of ages, complexions, body sizes, et cetera, represented throughout our materials. And then these are the materials that we created specifically related to stress management. And so these are examples of some of the topics that we focus on. Here we have meditation with a focus on peace, spirituality, and pride as a strategy to help calm chaos. We also do a session on the benefits of massage, and we actually provide monthly vouchers for participants to get a massage so that they can see if that is something that they want to add to their stress management strategies. Our primary outcome for the RESET study is weight change, and then we'll also look at change in stress measures over time. And so we launched this study in 2022. We've currently enrolled about 160 participants. We plan to continue enrolling participants for another couple of years until we reach our goal of 340. And we, hope to be able to demonstrate that this is an effective and useful program. We'll need to be able to test it in additional populations so that we can make it available on a larger scale. But now it's important for me to note that to be able to scale programs like RESET, it really is important to have participation from diverse populations. We have to have representation so that we know that the programs, the interventions, the medications, whatever it is we're talking about, works across diverse populations. However, we know that historically marginalized racial and ethnic groups, women, and other disenfranchised populations are typically underrepresented in clinical trials. And, I certainly recognize and acknowledge that there is a long history there, and there's, issues of trust and mistrust in the research community and medical system. But there certainly have been intentional efforts to understand and protect participants' rights and safety to ensure that the trials are handled with integrity. And so if you haven't already before, I would like to encourage you to think about participating in trials in your local area, or if there are national trials that you can be a part of, because if we are not represented when interventions, treatments, medications, whatever are being developed, then we may not be represented when it's time to reap the benefits of what's learned from those trials. And so as I move toward concluding, I just want to leave you with a couple of practical things as it relates to healthy stress management. And so when it comes to stress management, we can think about this in a couple of ways. We can either change the situation or we can change the reaction. And this has been referred to as the 4 A's. And so I'll start with changing the situation. There are some cases when we can avoid unnecessary stress. And so when we can change the situation through avoidance, it's to our benefit. When we can alter the situation so that it's no longer stressful, that's to our benefit as well, in a healthy approach. But I'm fully aware that there are some situations that cannot be changed. There are some stressful situations that are outside of our control. So when we find ourselves in that situation, it's important to have healthy strategies to cope during those stressful situations. And so that's when we adapt to the stress. We try to reframe the situation. We think about the things that we can do personally to sort of protect ourselves and buffer the effects of stress. And then it's important to understand when to accept the things that you cannot change, and to understand how to, again, operate in a way that is going to buffer the effects of stress given your circumstances. And then, lastly, I'll add sort of the 5th A is really to just adopt a healthy lifestyle. So stress management can be achieved through consuming a healthier diet, through becoming physically active, through self-care, through finding fun and relaxing things to do. And so I'm going to actually ask Dr. Price to talk a little bit about some very specific things that one can do to better cope with stress.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Carson. That was incredibly important research that you're doing, and thank you for giving an overview of some of the previous research that was done as well, especially the research that was specific to our community. So some empowerment actions that I'd like to leave you with today, just some examples on what you might be able to do to develop healthier stress management and coping skills. So when it comes to organization, sometimes having a disorganized or not a clean home can really stimulate some stress. I know personally it does for me. So how can you get organized? Make a plan to clean and organize your home on a regular basis. Make to-do lists so that you can compartmentalize all the things that you do have to do in your daily life, and try to write it down on paper and sparse it out throughout the week so it doesn't feel as overwhelming. Getting regular exercise, all of you completely aced that question at the beginning, so you understand that regular exercise is in fact a very healthy stress coping mechanism, and especially is great to do when you feel stressed. So if you are feeling stressed, maybe go on a walk instead of maybe eating that chocolate chip cookie. Talking to someone, maybe a therapist, a pastor, or a life coach, to help you really discuss some of the feelings that you are feeling and how you might cope with those feelings. There's stress coping techniques that you can employ, that you can also learn from a trained and licensed therapist, as well as techniques to help you heal from past trauma that often comes up and continues to be a chronic stress in our life. Some relaxation techniques, meditation and yoga are very common and well known to help reduce not only stress, but also improve insulin sensitivity and lower your risk for diabetes. And then journaling. Journaling is a great way to sort of talk to yourself a little bit by writing down your emotions and expressing that on paper. And then practicing gratitude. Sometimes we're so consumed around all the negative things that are happening, and we don't remember all of the things that we should be thankful for. So sometimes in the moment when you're feeling stressed, reminding yourself of 3 things that you're grateful for the day can also be helpful.
Awesome. Okay, so those are great practical strategies to implement. And so I want to make sure we have time for questions, but what I would like to do is, as a group, sort of lead us very quickly through one relaxation example, which is called progressive muscle relaxation. And this relieves muscle tension that can be caused by stress. It's been shown through research to assist with relief for mild to moderate anxiety. And so if you all will indulge me in your personal spaces and just sort of sit up straight up with your feet planted on the ground, I'd like to quickly walk us through a progressive muscle relaxation exercise. And what we're going to do is really just walk through and tense our muscle groups for just a few seconds and then relax it for about 10 seconds. And that intention really helps to work stress through your body. So I'm going to ask everyone to start with both of your hands and just make a fist and hold a tight fist. And you can close your eyes if you want to, if it'll help you to get into it. And we'll hold this here for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and release it. And then maybe wiggle your fingers a little bit and feel that stress going out of your fingers. And maybe bring your wrist around a little bit and just get the flexibility in there. Then we're going to have you to fold your hands back, so you really feel that stretch. So your forearms for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then relax it. And maybe just drop your hands by your side and shake it out. And then now we're going to work on our shoulders. So shrug your shoulders, pull those shoulders up to your ears and hold it. You want it to feel really tight. You want to feel the tension for a few seconds. 3, 2, 1. And then release it and shake it out. And then you want to squint your face. So get those frown lines in there, but we won't hold that for long because we don't want wrinkles. But squint your forehead and your eyes and your nose and hold it for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and release. And then last, we're going to have you just take a deep breath in, skipping a little bit in the interest of time. But just inhale so that we can stretch our chest and work our chest muscles. And hold that inhale for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then relax. And so we can do this on our own at any time. And you're really supposed to work your way all the way down through your hips, your legs, your thighs, your feet, your toes. So I encourage you to try that sometime on your own time. But that is an introduction to PMR for anyone who has not done it before. And so lastly, Dr. Price.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I'm just going to leave everyone with some resources to help you manage your stress. This will also be sent out with the survey. So before I've mentioned therapy for Black girls, this is a great resource to find a Black therapist. Clutterbug.com. So if you are someone that is ready to get your house together and organized, this website's a great resource to figure out what type of organizer you are, to tailor your sort of organizing plan. And then some relaxation techniques that you might want to try. There's a meditation app that I like, Insight Timer. And then there's a couple of yoga classes. One is online, Black Girl Workouts. It's on YouTube and it's a free YouTube course. And then Black to Yoga is based in Oakland, and they also offer online classes available for $10, as well as in-person classes. I don't know how much the in-person ones are, but those are two great resources if you're looking to get into yoga. Especially the free one. So now we'll open it up to questions, and thank you all for listening.
That was great. Thank you so much, Dr. Price, as well as Dr. Carson. That was fantastic. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. One is going back to, so Dr. Price, at the beginning, you talked a lot about cortisol. This question popped up at that time. Since saliva was used to measure cortisol content, one of our participants is wondering, does cortisol have a taste?
Oh, interesting question. No, you can't taste it. That would be nice if you could, then you maybe could have a trigger to know when you need to elicit some relaxation techniques, but no, cortisol does not have a taste.
Thank you. Another one, has anyone conducted similar research on Black men? I think this came up as you were talking, Dr. Carson, a lot about the studies that you're doing and the studies that have been done in the past.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So certainly some of the observational work has documented relationships between stress and weight gain over time in Black men. In terms of the intervention work and some of the, sort of tailored work that I'm doing, I'm not aware of anyone who's done work in that space. I think it can be, a very important field to target because the unique stressors that Black men experience certainly contribute to adverse health outcomes. I think that question also goes back to the need for diverse participation in clinical trials. And, I hate to say it, but Black men have been historically difficult to recruit for clinical trials. But that doesn't mean that the effort should be abandoned, and we have to be intentional and understand how to increase that participation.
Yeah, as well as increasing Black male scientists who would be able to represent this field and move that science forward.
Thank you for that. This last question that we have, I don't see any in the chat. Oh, I do see one in the chat. We'll come back to that. But the last question that I have in the Q&A box just kind of points out, yes, this webinar does focus on individual stress management. I loved talking about the 4 A's and just kind of thinking about how do we adopt all of that. That last one that you threw in there, the 5th one, how do we adopt, really leaning into and modeling and putting those practices into everyday life? Can we expand on how we can practically and politically implement stress reduction within the Black community is one question. The other is, what policies can we support given that there's so much stress that's caused by systemic issues? Just wondering if either of you have anything to weigh in on those 2 questions.
Dr. Carlson, do you want to start?
I will start. That is a big question and a very important question. And I will, be honest in that I have started to shift my thinking in my work in this direction a little bit myself. Because as you've noted, a lot of the stress that is experienced by African Americans and Black Americans is because of systemic issues. And so, I agree that I think we need to start thinking about policy level changes that can be made to improve environments for us, to improve our communities. And, I don't want to sound cliche, but, voting is very important. Advocating for funding and resources at the local level is very important. being engaged and involved in communities, very important. But, you know, I certainly take your point. I tend to think of this as, you know, the quote from Dr. King about, you know, the moral arc. It takes time, but it bends towards justice. And so I think as we are trying to implement these systems level things that are going to take time, it's good to have things that you can do at the individual level to try to buffer the impacts of some of the systemic things that will just take a lot of time to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why we talk a lot about the individual, you know, what can we do to empower ourselves? Because, you know, as Dr. Carson points out, it is going to take a lot of time. And frankly, there's not enough of us in the seats of power to implement change quickly enough. And so we really need to have our own tools to help us manage the stress, cope with it, and adapt to it, so that we are, you know, improving our lives and our longevity. Because as we know, we pointed, you know, I mentioned weathering and this chronic stress, and having lived through all of the injustices that Black people have had to endure over the generations has really had a negative impact on our health.
Thank you so much. Points well taken. I want to just acknowledge we are 2 minutes over time. If you've got just a little bit more to give, we've got one more question that popped up. Was premenopause or menopause raised in any of these studies or related studies?
Yeah, so I can certainly say that it is a data point that we collect in my research study. So it is a question that we ask about and a variable that we capture. We essentially sort of account for it through our statistical analysis. It has not emerged as a significant predictor in some of the earlier work, but, you know, I'll be curious to see if that holds in this larger research study that we're doing, also where our age range is wider. And so for the pilot work that I presented, most of those participants were premenopausal because the maximum age was 45. But for this study, we have a wider range from 21 to 75. So that's certainly something we will explore.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. The last question in the chat, I can answer. One of our participants is wondering how or who would they contact to get involved in the trial programs. I don't know, Dr. Carson, if you can also speak to that, but I know in 2024, CBHN will be working with all of us research and programs, and that could be a great avenue to get involved in some of those research programs. And so I will reach out to this participant personally when that time comes to make sure that they get connected as well.
Awesome. And oh, sorry, Dr. Carson, did you want to say something?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Another great resource is you can look at clinicaltrials.org, and you can search for even specific conditions, or you can even put a study that's looking for healthy participants or whatever it is. You can search by state, location, etc. And you can get a list of studies that have either completed or ongoing recruiting participants. If you live in near a university, you can also look at some of their medical clinic or clinical research center websites. They will also often post advertisements for recruiting into studies.
Cantastic. Thank you both again so much, Dr. Price and Dr. Carson. It has been wonderful to have you leading this session. Candace, I've really learned a lot, and I have appreciated your leadership on this series so much. So thank you again. Just as a reminder, as we wrap up here, I like to give a couple of announcements of the upcoming events that we've got. We will have the last series of this session sometime in October. We originally were looking at October 5th, but we're kind of debating October 12th. So we will send that out to everyone just to clarify the date, and you'll be able to find that on our events page. We will also have a Brands, Beauty, and Breast Cancer webinar for Health for Life, featuring some of our speakers on the non-toxic Black Black Beauty Project coming up on October 19th at 12 p.m. And then we will have the final series, session 5, Navigating Resources for Caregiving and the Black Community, on November 9th at 12 p.m. as well. And you can keep up with all of the things that we've got going on our social media accounts. On Facebook, Facebook and Instagram, we can be found at Your CBHN. On LinkedIn, if you search California Black Health Network, you will find us. On Twitter, we are at Your CBHN. And on YouTube, we are the California Black Health Network. And YouTube is where we post all of the recordings from previous Health for Life sessions, as well as our health equity forums. So please feel free to check those out and keep up with us over time. Again, I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight. Thank you for sticking on, going over just a little bit. I hope that you all have a great evening, and we'll see you next time.